How's it going, everyone? Carlo here from All You Can Board, and today I'm going to be comparing two games that you've probably seen compared a whole bunch over the past couple of years. That is Dune Imperium and Lost Ruins of Arnak. So I'll get it right out of the way right off the bat. These games are not as similar as I think a lot of people have made them seem. These always get compared because they're both the combination of deck building and worker placement. They both came out in 2020. And I think they both have a similar kind of level of complexity, and I guess they just got released around the same time, and because of the deck building and worker placement combination, a lot of people were asking, like, which is the better game, and there's tons of these comparisons out there, but I find they're actually very, very different games, and that's actually the main point that I want to make in this video, and the reason why I've chosen to do this video. I'm going to be comparing these across 15 different categories, and basically this is to highlight how different they really are, because we have people asking us sometimes, in our YouTube comments section, or in our Discord server, which game is the better game, or which game should I get, and it's always a tough thing to answer in just, a couple sentences or whatnot, so from now on, hopefully we can point people towards this video to let them know which game might be more for them. So a couple things I want to mention before we get into it is Dune Imperium was designed by Paul Dennen and published by Direwolf Games. Paul Dennen has also designed Clank and all the other Clank games like the Legacy Incorporated or whatnot, as well as Eternal Chronicles of the Throne, which is a two-player card battling game. So he's got a bit of a pedigree in the industry already. He's been designing games for a while. Lost Ruins of Arnak is co-designed by Min and Elwyn, and this is their first and only game so far, and published by CGE. So just keep that in mind when comparing the games, that this one is from a more experienced designer, whereas this is a debut design from a design team. The other thing I'll mention is that I'm just be comparing the base games only. I know that these games both have expansions. I own Rise of Ix, but have not yet played it, and I don't know anyone who has the Hidden Leaders expansion for this, so I'm just going to be comparing base games only here. I've played both games at almost all player counts. I've played Dune Imperium solo with 2 and with 3, so just not with 4 players, and I've probably played it close to 10 times now, probably 7 or 8 times. Lost Ruins of Arnak, I've played at 2, 3, and 4 players. I just have not played the solo mode. This one I've played not quite as much as Dune Imperium, maybe 5 or 6 times, I think. We're going to kick it off. The first category here is going to be approachability. So that's just kind of entails, rules overhead, setup of the game, ease of play, ease of teach, all that kind of thing. Like when you first get into the game, what is it like? So I had the benefit of being taught Lost Ruins of Arnak by Dylan, actually. But since the first time I played it with him, I did have to go, I went a while without playing it again, and I did have to go back and revisit the rulebook a couple times and look through it and kind of relearn parts of it myself. Whereas Dune Imperium, I learned it myself, just read through the rulebook and was able to get it to the table and play right away. Even going back and looking through the rulebooks afterwards, I found that Dune Imperium has, in my opinion, the better rulebook. It seems like it has fewer rules, there are fewer little edge cases, and it just feels like I've had to go back to the rulebook less while playing, and I felt like even just after reading it through once, everything stuck pretty well. Like I felt like it was, a lot of the things that you do in the game just kind of made sense, and I didn't have to think like, oh, what order does this happen? Or not to say that it's a perfect rulebook or anything like that, but I was quite surprised with it, and for the weight and complexity level of the actual decisions that you're making in the game, the rules feel pretty straightforward and fairly easy to get into, and I haven't really had any trouble teaching the game either. And this isn't to say the Lost Ruins of Arnak is like a much more complicated rulebook, but it is a much longer rulebook. There's a lot of different types of actions and things that you can do, and there's a difference between, the actions that you take that actually count as actions that spend a turn versus free actions that you can do in addition to things on your turn. So sometimes I've had to look up which ones are free actions or not. So there's a little bit more to maybe keep in mind with Lost Ruins of Arnak. But otherwise, in terms of the actual complexity level of the game and all that kind of thing, they're pretty similar. Setup time, I imagine, is pretty similar between both the games. So it's tough to give one game really the edge over the other. One of them is a little more kind of maybe beginner friendly, just in the sense that it's more forgiving, and I would say that's Lost Ruins of Arnak, but that'll kind of come into play in some of the other categories I'm going to talk about a bit later as well. So next category is theme and art. We can also lump components into here. It's kind of just like the immersion level of the game. How immersed are you in the experience? How does everything look on the table? And that sort of thing. So Dune Imperium, some people have criticized it for saying it's not as thematic as they would like for a Dune game. And I mean, it's tough to compare to the original 1979 Dune board game, which I myself haven't played, but I've heard a lot about, and it sounds amazing, and it's specifically a very thematic game where you're playing as the different factions in Dune, whether it's, the Bene Gesserit or whatnot, and, what you're doing throughout the game, you always feel like you're a part of that faction. Everything you do is thematic. Whereas in Dune Imperium, the theme, I don't think it's quite as like pasted on as I think some people have said. As someone who has read the first Dune book, I still felt it was a fairly thematic game, and I definitely felt pretty immersed in it. It doesn't feel like when you have the character powers at the start, it doesn't necessarily, you don't feel like you're Paul for the whole game just because you have Paul's ability. It's not like, neither of these games excel because of the theme, is what I'm trying to say. Lost Ruins of Arnak has a theme that we've seen kind of done in a similar way in other games. We've seen a lot of these kind of exploration, exploring temples and kind of lost ruins kind of things. We've seen in like Sumatra. We've seen in, I guess even Quest for El Dorado kind of has a similar backdrop to it. And in here, like, there's pretty thematic cards that you can get and stuff like that. But either way, it's pretty light. In terms of the artwork and components, it's tough to give an edge to either game here. I think for the average gamer or the person who hasn't maybe read Dune or who maybe didn't like the Dune book or whatnot, this has the maybe more inviting kind of, artwork and overall package in terms of the components for your kind of, I would say, average gamer and more entry-level gamer. So I would say if you're, you have no experience with either game, you're not familiar with the Dune series, and you're trying to think of which one is the better starting point for you, or let's say you're trying to get, your significant other or a friend of yours that doesn't play as many games into one of these, Lost Ruins of Arnak might be the more inviting one, easier sell to get someone interested in trying. Either way, both the games have fairly nice components. I will say that Dune Imperium has since come out with a deluxe version, and there's like a deluxe upgrade pack that you can buy. I know some people criticize the look of the board, and there's fancier new components that you can get, but yeah, either way, I mean, if I had to give the edge one way or another, I might lean slightly towards Lost Ruins of Arnak just for the kind of more widespread appeal, but I think both games look great on the table, and I have no issues with the components or the artwork myself, and it is cool to see, the artwork on the cards in Dune Imperium. A lot of the artwork on the cards is based on the actors that were actually put into the Dune movie, which I haven't actually seen myself yet, but did recognize some of the actors, so that's a pretty cool little added touch there. So next up, we're going to talk about worker placement. So this is obviously a big category and one of the main mechanisms at play in both of these games. I'll talk about Dune Imperium first. So the worker placement in here is very interesting because on the board there are different sections that basically correspond to the different houses and factions that you're going to interact with. And your cards in the game are going to determine, your cards will have symbols on them that correspond to those spaces. So which actions you can take on the board are based on whichever cards you play. So you'll play a card, and whichever symbols are there, it means you can go to one of those spots on the board with your worker. So I really like that you're limited to where you can go by what you have in your hand, and that also determines which cards you're going to buy later and stuff. I'm not going to get too into the cards now because that's actually the next category I'm going to talk about afterwards. But the other thing I like in Dune Imperium, you start with 2 workers, or I guess they're called agents in this game, but there's a way to get a third one by going to the Sword Master action at the top. It's something that takes a lot of kind of time and commitment to get that third agent. You have to save up a decent amount of Solari, which is your money in this game, and then go to an action space to unlock it, but then you might have a third worker for the rest of the game. And it can be a big advantage having that third action rather than just taking 2, and it's optional, so it's really interesting. I've seen people not get the third worker, and you can even, I've heard lots, I've seen people win without even taking the third worker. Some people go for it as their very first thing at the start of the game, and because you don't have to feed your workers like in a lot of other worker placement games, there's no upkeep. Once you have that third worker, it's not like there's extra maintenance or things to keep up with to manage them. So, but it does set you back if you're spending your money doing other things rather than like if you're getting a worker rather than spending that Solari on other things, like taking a seat on the High Council, which can help you buy cards for cheaper or whatnot. Lost Ruins of Arnak, you are a little more, in some ways you're a little more free, and in other ways you're more limited. You have a starting kind of space where I just realized I forgot to give overviews of both of these games and how they play, so that's just going to come up as we're talking about them. In Lost Ruins of Arnak, you have this kind of, these original, I think it's 5 worker placement spots that are the same the whole game, but then every time you play, there's a second section and a third section that are going to have different spots that are going to be determined. There's these face-down guardian tiles, and throughout the game, when you go to one of these spots, you're going to flip over the tile to see what the space will give you, but also what you have to do to potentially defeat this guardian and gain this guardian token, which will end up giving you, I think they're 5 points each at the end of the game. So you have your basic worker placement spots, and you can't even access the other stuff on the board until you get these compasses, enough compasses that you can explore these new regions of the area. So at the start, you're more limited in where you can go, but there's also different types of travel icons that you need to have on your cards or from other abilities to get to somewhere. One spot on the board might say that you need 2 of these planes, so you need to either have cards that have this plane symbol on them or activate them somewhere else to even get there. So there's a lot of requirements. Like, both of these games have requirements that sort of come at least partially or entirely from the cards that determine where on the board you can actually go. But Dune Imperium, everything is kind of available to you at the start as long as you have the symbols on your cards, whereas Lost Ruins of Arnak, you're definitely limited at the start, and then you need to get a lot of these resources going before you can explore or go to places that other players have already uncovered for the rest. So for me personally, I definitely preferred the worker placement in Dune Imperium. It felt more like there's, in Lost Ruins of Arnak, it feels a bit more like if someone goes somewhere and gets this type of resource, you can probably get this resource in a number of different ways, whether it's on the research track or a different worker placement spot or whatnot. In Dune Imperium, a lot of the time, it feels like if someone took that spot, there's certain things you can do elsewhere, but a lot of that, you hear those groans a lot when someone goes to a spot and you go, oh, I was really planning on going to that spot this game or this round or whatnot. So I'm definitely going to give the edge to Dune Imperium in the worker placement category here. It just feels tighter and more interesting the way the card play works in. So speaking of that card play, we're going to talk now about deck building and also just the cards in general. So the first thing I want to highlight is the starting decks that you get. So in Dune Imperium, like a lot of deck building games, you have a starting deck. Like if we look back to Dominion, the kind of vanilla, most basic kind of worker deck building game out there, you have gold, and then you have your victory point cards. And those cards, and not only in Dominion, and a lot of other games do it too, games like Star Realms and Hero Realms and stuff like that, where the cards you start off with are all pretty boring, standard. They don't really have many interesting decisions, right? And Lost Ruins of Arnak kind of falls into that same, I don't want to say trap, but that same category of the cards are either going to give you gold or they're going to give you compasses, and then they're going to have certain symbols in the corner that just are either going to be the feet for traveling, or you'll have a boat or whatnot. But they're pretty standard cards, and there isn't a lot of decision making that comes into play early in the game when you're playing mostly those basic standard cards. Dune Imperium, yes, the cards are weaker that you start with, and obviously you want to buy cards from the main card row that strengthen your deck, but there's more variety in the cards in your deck right from the start. There's certain cards that you start with that there's only 1 of, and some of them you have at most 2 of, and they all allow you to go to different spots on the board or allow you to do different things. So even though they're more basic cards, and yes, you do want to try and get better cards in your deck, the cards in Dune Imperium are more interesting right from the start. Like right from the very first round, you might have 4 or 5 different cards in your hand, and the decisions in terms of which of these cards you're actually going to play for what, and something I should have mentioned before is, in Dune Imperium, you're going to get a couple of turns for your agents, your workers basically, and then once you've used up all your workers, you're going to take a reveal turn where you reveal the rest of the cards in your hand, and you get to use the symbols on the bottom of your card, which didn't apply to the agent turns where you're actually placing your workers. So yeah, it's just very interesting right from the start how you decide how you're going to use those 5 cards, instead of just like in Lost Ruins of Arnak, you're going to end up playing your whole hand probably, and it's just like, how much gold and how many compasses am I getting this first round, and maybe I'm going to save this one, travel symbol for that one spot I want to get to. But ultimately, I find the actual cards right from the start, the decks are more interesting in Dune Imperium. And as I kind of mentioned previously, just the way you're choosing to build your deck is, again, more interesting to me in Dune Imperium, because the cards that you add are going to determine which sort of factions or alliances that you can interact with on the board, which ones you can actually visit. So this is going to really determine a lot of your strategy, and there's a lot more variety from card to card, it feels like. In Lost Ruins of Arnak, you see a lot of the same symbols, a lot of the same resources come up, the same, draw a card symbol or trash a card, and a lot of the time it's just different combinations. One card might cost you, 2 and might let you draw a card and get a certain resource, and another card might cost 3 instead and it gets you a more powerful resource, but you also still draw a card. Like, the differences between these cards are a little more, maybe slightly less noticeable. They're more incremental, whereas in Dune Imperium, a lot of the time the decision of which cards to buy or how to play them is going to have a bigger sort of widespread effect. So I'm going to give the nod to Dune Imperium here again. But this isn't to criticize Lost Ruins of Arnak too much. Like, the card play can be really fun. There's some really fun cards and some thematic ones. Again, these archaeological items and stuff. Sometimes you buy ones, or even the artifacts that you can get throughout the game. There are some really fun cards and stuff, but I think overall I definitely have to give the nod to Dune Imperium. So next we're going to talk about resources. both games rely fairly heavily on resources, and I'm going to pause here again because I'm realizing I didn't talk either about my first impressions about the game when I said I was going to talk overview and first impressions. So very quick, because this ties into this category. The very first time I played Lost Ruins of Arnak, the first thing I said after Dylan and I ended the game was, I feel like this game has too many resources, or more than it needs. Not that 5 resources is too many for any game necessarily, but for what you're doing in this game, it felt like, to me, too much of the game was about the resources. And I said to Dylan, I wonder how much better or how much more I'd like this game if it had like 3 resources instead of 5. Because they also have progressively kind of stronger, like golden compasses can be fairly similar, but then you've got papyrus and then arrowheads, and then you've got the rubies or the red gems or whatnot, and it feels like each one's kind of more powerful, and there's this kind of conversion hierarchy where you can convert resources and that kind of thing. So that was my sort of first impression. I didn't mind it, but it felt a little too much like the game focused a lot on those resources, and that again, it should have had maybe 3 resources instead of 5. I played this one first, and then I played Dune Imperium, and Dune Imperium actually has 3 different resources, and I enjoyed it a fair bit, but I also remember thinking a couple things. First off, it felt a little bit too long. I think it took me probably around 2.5 hours to play the first time, and to me that felt a bit long for this type of worker placement game for how much it had going on. And the other thing I had as an initial criticism was just that even though I liked the game and I liked a lot of what it had going on, I wasn't crazy about some of the ways that you get points, and that I'm going to get into that a bit later, but it was the way that you get points involving going up these alliance tracks and taking actions, and it felt to me like some of the points you got just sort of happened along the way, that you didn't have to fight for them. So anyways, first impressions aside, let's get back to talking into resources here, because Lost Ruins of Arnak, even though these games both get called deck building and worker placement games, to me, Lost Ruins of Arnak isn't, yes, it has deck building, yes, it has worker placement, but it's not a deck building game or a worker placement game. To me, it's a resource conversion game. That's what the game is all about. And almost everything you do in this game, resources are at the forefront, and you're trying to figure out, how am I going to get, more resources of this specific kind, or how am I going to get this specific combination of resources to do this specific thing on the resource track, or to defeat this guardian because I need these resources. That's really the whole game. Like, not to say that there's, that it's just about collecting and maximizing your resources, but really you're trying to do as much as you can every round, and everything that you can do anytime you think, well, can I take another action? How many more actions can I get out of this round? It's almost always going to come from resources, and usually getting more resources is just going to allow you to do more things and do more things quicker, and then you get something in an earlier round, which then kind of snowballs throughout the game. So really it's all about the efficiency of your resource conversion. That's what this game is all about. After repeated plays, I still feel like it might have, I might enjoy it more if there were 3 or 4 resources instead of 5. I don't think the 5 are essential, especially because they're not necessarily particularly like thematic. It's not like this resource is used for this one specific thing, or this is used for this. It's just kind of, sometimes you need these ones, sometimes you need these ones. This one is generally kind of worth more, but yeah, it's not a particularly interesting system with the resources in my opinion. Dune Imperium has some similarities going on, but because a lot more of the game comes down to, there's conflicts and stuff that I'm going to get into later, resources definitely play a big part, and there's certain places on the board where you need to spend resources to go there, but it's not quite as, about the efficiency of getting as much as you can out of every resource and trying to have more to get more turns, and they don't play as big of a part. They're kind of just a tool to, access certain action spaces on the board. Like, there's somewhere, if you don't have enough of a certain resource, you might not be able to go there. But yeah, it's not like the whole game revolves around the resources quite as much. So if what you're looking for is a very resource-heavy game, and you like that idea of, oh, how do I get this and convert it into this, you're probably going to like Lost Ruins of Arnak more, because there isn't as much conversion as just straight up like resource acquisition in Dune Imperium, and then you're spending them, but there isn't as much of like converting one into the next and upgrading resources and that kind of thing. The other thing is, in Dune Imperium, I think they're a little more thematic, like what you're spending water for, or what you're spending spice for versus Solari or whatever. Like, they each have their categories a little bit more, I find, whereas in Lost Ruins of Arnak they kind of bleed together a bit more. Next up, we're going to talk about the turn and round structure of the games. So Dune Imperium plays over an indeterminate or indefinite, I guess, number of rounds. You're basically just going to be checking at the end of every round to see if anyone has reached at least 10 points or more, and if so, whoever has the most points, someone might have 10, but someone else might have 11 or 12. Highest points wins as soon as a round ends when one player has at least 10 or more. Throughout the round, as I mentioned before, every player is going to have 2 workers. So on your turn, you're going to take one. You're going to play a card, take an action on the board with one of your 2 workers, or potentially 3 if you've acquired that third one. And once you can either, and then it's going to go to the next player and it's going to come back around to you and whatnot. So either once you've spent all your workers, you're going to then take a reveal turn, or you can still have workers, or again, they're called agents in this game. You can still have agents left. You can have 1 or 2 left and you can just reveal. But once you reveal, that's it for the round. And what that means is you're going to get the abilities on the bottom half of your card instead of the top half, which corresponds to when you're taking the actions. So you always have 5 cards in your hand at the start of the round. So let's say even from the first round, you're going to end up playing 2 cards potentially for each of your one for each of your agents, and then you're going to reveal those other 3 cards. There's other ways that you can draw cards and stuff. So sometimes your reveal is going to involve a lot more cards, but you're basically going to reveal, which is going to potentially add to your combat strength, and you might get some other little effects, and then you're going to be able to buy cards from the market row in front of you. You're just going to keep playing round after round, but there's this kind of, there's a conflict that's up for grabs every round. There's level 1, 2, and 3 conflicts that everyone's kind of fighting over. At the end of the round, when everyone's done their reveal turns, you're going to be sort of comparing your combat strength and seeing who's going to win this conflict, and that's where you're going to be getting the majority of, victory points in the game. There's also other rewards, like you can get intrigue cards and big, chunks of resources and things like that. So that's kind of the basic round and turn structure of Dune Imperium. Lost Ruins of Arnak is a little bit different because it always plays in 5 rounds. You always know exactly that the game ends after 5 rounds. And the other thing is, there's times where one player is going to be out of the round much earlier than someone else, and you might be sitting there watching another player take turns. So in Lost Ruins of Arnak, it's up to you. As long as you can take an action, you have the resources to meet an action that you can fulfill, maybe moving up your research track, or you're going to acquire an assistant or whatever. You have workers left. You can squeeze a lot out of your out of each round in Lost Ruins of Arnak, and that's kind of what the game is all about, is seeing how many turns you can get, how many things you can get done. And the more you get done in the first round, the more you're going to kind of have things like assistants and whatever in your possession that you can then use in future rounds, which lets you kind of get even more turns. Like someone might get 4 turns in the first round and someone else might get 6 or 7 turns. So you might sit there after you've passed because you have nothing left you can do, and you might watch someone else take an action and take another action and take another action just because they might have been more efficient. They might have produced more resources or gotten ahead in some other way to just be able to take more actions. So I kind of prefer the whole idea of you use your workers first and then you have that big reveal. But I also like the fact that it's an unpredictable number of rounds. It just makes it so you can't quite calculate, like, if I get here, then by this round I'm only going to get this many more turns. Like, you don't know if you're going to, like, the only way you really know when the game's going to end if you know that you yourself are going to hit 10 points or you can see that someone else is. And in Lost Ruins of Arnak, it just has a bit more of a predictable, overall structure to the game. And I just find that I find it a little more interesting in Dune Imperium, just the way that all works out. Next, we're going to talk about game length and downtime, and also how that relates to the turn structure. So we'll talk about downtime first, because I just mentioned that in Lost Ruins of Arnak, there's going to be times where you might watch someone take a few extra actions. I've never found it to be really a big issue while playing. Like, even if someone else is going to get 2, 3, 4 more actions than you in a round, it's probably not going to take very long. Usually it's because they have a couple of these specific resources left and they know why they were getting that resource, because they wanted to take this action. So it's not like they're going to sit there pondering every other action for minutes at a time. Not really going to be a lot of downtime, but there definitely is going to be some, just in terms of certain players ending. And obviously the more players you have, if you're playing with 4 players, there's going to be a lot more downtime as compared to 2 or 3, obviously. But that's the same thing with Dune Imperium. When it's not your turn, you're just watching and waiting for other people. But in Dune Imperium, other than if someone has a 3rd worker or they took the Mentat, which gives you an extra worker for that round, usually people are going to end the round around a similar time. Someone might get 1 or 2 more actions, but usually there's going to be less downtime in Dune Imperium, I find, than in Lost Ruins of Arnak. In terms of the length of the game, I would say that overall, so far from my plays, I think Dune Imperium has run a little bit longer than Lost Ruins of Arnak. I will say that both games do take longer than I'd like. I wish both games played a little bit shorter. I think as I played them both a bit more, like, some of that playtime got shaved down a little bit, and again, they do really depend on player count. But that is an issue that I have with both games. I think they both take a little bit longer than I'd like for what they have going on. But yeah, overall, I think the length is still I would say Dune Imperium on average takes probably around 2 hours. If you're playing with 2 players or 3 experienced players, you could probably get it, hour and a half kind of range, but I can't really see it going much quicker than that. Also, sometimes it really depends on what happens. We had a game that we played on our charity live stream last month where we thought it was going to end earlier, but then someone did something to kind of deny someone winning a battle, which would have given them the points they needed to win, and then the game went another full round, so that added probably another half hour to the game. So you never really know what you're going to get with Dune Imperium. Lost Ruins of Arnak maybe has a little more of an expected, the range of time is probably a little easier to kind of predict because the game is always going to be 5 rounds. But again, an hour and a half, 90 minutes is probably standard for this game. I have had it go a bit longer, but not too much longer. So I'd say on average, Dune Imperium probably tends to be the longer game, and that's where I would give the nod to Lost Ruins of Arnak just for being a little quicker. Now let's talk about player interaction and tension. So this one there's actually quite a bit different between these two games in this category. And I have to give the nod, in a big way here, to Dune Imperium because there is a lot more player interaction in Dune Imperium and a lot more tension to the game. And when I'm playing a worker placement game, and again, I know I've said that Lost Ruins of Arnak is maybe more of a resource conversion game, but you're still, worker placement is still playing a big part in what you do and how you take actions on the board. And I just find that having that, and especially it tends to be too that usually the longer the game is, the more player interaction I want. If I'm going to sit here doing an activity that's kind of multiplayer solitaire, for lack of a better term, I don't need the game to be all that long. And not that I'm not calling Lost Ruins of Arnak necessarily multiplayer solitaire, but you don't get in each other's way a whole lot. The player interaction is fairly low. There's certain things that you're racing up the track to get to before the other person maybe, or if you get to a spot before someone else, you might get to a guardian that they might have wanted to go to, or a spot they might have, even if they didn't know what kind of guardian was there. There's certain spots where you might think, oh, I wish I had been able to go to that spot where that other player went, or buying a card from the market row, but it's not a whole lot of direct player interaction. It's more like you did something that other person was going to do first, or vice versa. So not a whole lot of player interaction, but it's also not entirely multiplayer solitaire. Dune Imperium, the main thing is the conflicts. First off, let's get back to worker placement for 1 second, then I'll talk about conflicts. The worker placement itself, as I talked about, leads to a lot more interaction and tension because of the competition for the spots out there, and the fact that a lot of the spots you go to, it's whatever is there you can't accomplish elsewhere, or it might be a much lesser effect somewhere else, so that really comes into play. But the main thing is the conflicts, and throughout the game you're going to be getting these troops that are going to go into your garrison, and then from the garrison you can put them directly into a conflict. So at the end of the round, when you assess the total strength of the both or all players kind of armies or whatnot, you're only assessing what's actually in the conflict. So you can build up your garrison and put all these troops in there, and players might be thinking, oh, this guy might be gearing up for a big conflict round. But if you didn't actually put them into the conflict, you might be saving them for a future round. And then you have these intrigue cards in your hand that no one really knows what you're holding, and you might be playing that to swing a conflict your way, and so you never really know what to invest in or which conflict you want to try to win or not win, which spots to go to earlier rather than later. It just feels like there's a lot more kind of those groans around the table again of someone being like, oh, I really needed to go to that spot, or oh, I can't believe you beat me by 1 troop in that conflict, or there's always these sighs of oh, I wish I would have been able to get that done. And in Dune Imperium, that usually happens as a result of something your opponent did to block you or beat you in a conflict or something like that. Whereas in Lost Ruins of Arnak, I found that those moments of disappointment were usually just either my own poor planning or getting unlucky with turning over a guardian that I just couldn't meet the resources to fulfill the needs to defeat that guardian or whatnot. So yeah, I'm definitely going to give the nod in a big way to Dune Imperium for player interaction and tension. It just feels like a more exciting game all the way through, and a big thing for that is the scoring, which I'll talk about in an upcoming category. Before I get into that though, let's talk player count real quick. So Dune Imperium, I've enjoyed quite a bit at all the player counts I've played. I was actually pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed this game solo still. The way it runs with solo is you have this deck of, it's called House Haggle cards, and you're basically just turning over a card from the deck. You basically always, whether you're playing solo or 2 players, you're sort of simulating a 3-player game. So in a 2-player game, you're going to use the House Haggle deck as well, and you're going to turn over one of those cards per round to kind of simulate that 3rd player, and you're going to take a 3rd player's color and just place it on that space on the board. They're also going to have ways that they automatically add troops to the conflict, so it's kind of simulating a 3rd player, even though they're not necessarily particularly intelligent. They might not be going to the right spots, but the 2 or 3 times I've played this with 2 players, it has worked surprisingly well having that third player in, and it's super easy and straight. You just flip a card from the deck, put a worker where it goes, and then that's pretty much it. So it runs itself, and in the solo game, you're basically just flipping 2 of those cards to simulate 2 different players. So at both those counts, it works surprisingly well, but by far my favorite player count I've played it at so far has been 3 players. Just having that other third player there just makes the conflicts really interesting, especially when it's not just an AI-controlled thing from these cards. It doesn't add too much more downtime having a third player there making decisions. I'm very curious to play it with 4 players because generally with these types of high player interaction, worker placement games, I usually, very often enjoy them at the highest player count. I just don't know yet if Dune Imperium with 4 is going to be worth the extra, it's definitely going to add some playtime, or at least I think it would. Everyone in the 4-player game starts with 1 point, so you basically only need 9 points instead of 10, so there's that kind of speeds it up a bit. But, having the added tension of 4 people fighting over a conflict might actually be really fun, so I can't really comment on that, but so far I would say I recommend this most at 3, but it's still very good with 2 and solo. Lost Ruins of Arnak, as I mentioned before, I've not played solo, but I've played 2 through 4. I don't know if I would ever really even want to play this game again with 4 players. Because the player interaction is fairly low, I think you really don't gain much by adding a 4th player compared to 3. It's, it's maybe a little bit tighter on the board in terms of the spaces you're going for, but the amount of added downtime, especially later in the game when everyone's taking so many actions per round, having one more player who's basically trying to squeeze out every possible action that they can in a round, in round 4 and 5, the 4-player game runs a lot longer than I'd like, so honestly, I've enjoyed it probably similarly with 2 or 3 players. With 3, there's a little bit more of that tension because there's a bit more of the racing to spots on the track, and again, a bit more competition on the board, so it's probably worth it adding the 3rd player because even though it takes a bit longer, it does add a little bit more tension to the game, so probably best with 3, but still quite good at 2, and yeah, pretty similar at both counts. I wouldn't say that, if you do most of your gaming at 2, you're not going to miss out on a lot by playing this primarily at 2 compared to at 3. So now let's talk about scoring. I definitely find the scoring more interesting in Dune Imperium, even though, so I talked about my first impressions of both of these games and how the first time I played Dune Imperium, some of the scoring felt underwhelming, and to be fair, that hasn't completely gone away for me. There have been games where, because you take an action with the Fremen, you move up the Fremen track, and basically each of these tracks, when you get to the 2nd spot, you get a victory point, and then if you get up to the 4th spot, if you're the first person there, you take this little alliance token, and you get a 2nd victory point, but you can lose it if someone else overpasses you, overtakes you on the track. So there's still some times where someone goes oh yeah, I'm going to take this action, and then someone goes, oh yeah, don't forget you move up on this track, and you go, oh yeah, I move up here, oh I guess I get a point, and it feels like you just sort of got the point. You weren't trying to get a point that round, you were just needed that action to get that resource, and as a result, you're now high enough on this track that you happened to get a point. So sometimes you get to the end of the game, and whether you won or lost, you might look and say, half my points were just from moving up on these tracks just as a result of taking actions. You might feel like you didn't have to quite earn those, and sometimes that leads the games are usually very close in Dune Imperium, which I like. I like that the scoring, because you're only going up to 10, sometimes the game ends and someone got 11, someone else got 10, and someone got 8 or 9, and it can be really tight, and so it can make for these unpredictable finishes, which I really like. But sometimes I do have that feeling of I wish I could have got more points from somewhere else. If you're not getting them from conflicts, then the other big way you can get them is by buying these cards, the Spice Must Flow, which give you a point and get added into your deck. But I do like how much, because you're only going up to 10 points, every point feels like it matters a lot. It's a big deal. And if you have a round where you got 2 or 3 points and nobody, your other opponent or one of your opponents got 0 or only got 1, that can really feel like a big advantage for you compared to them. So, I do really like the way the scoring works overall. It's not perfect. It's not necessarily super ideal, and I'm kind of wondering what the Rise of Ix expansion does to potentially address that a little bit and maybe provide some other opportunities for scoring. But overall, I do like how that contributes to the tension in the game, and how there also isn't really a runaway leader problem, because usually if someone got ahead on points, it's usually because they invested a lot of their troops into a particular conflict. So they might have spent most of the troops from their garrison, put them in the conflict, and won that conflict and gotten 1 or 2 points. And maybe the player who's lagging behind by 3 or 4 points, they have a bunch of their troops still in their garrison. So it can be misleading if you just look at the board and see one person has like 8 points, someone else is at 3. You might think they're absolutely destroying that player, but that other player might, win a conflict to get 2 points, move up on a couple tracks, and suddenly the game might be even later. So I like what that aspect of the scoring. It makes things feel close and sort of unpredictable right to the end. Lost Ruins of Arnak, because it's purely a game of efficiency and that resource conversion, usually the scores are like very high, and a lot of the time there's a bit of that runaway leader problem. Like if at the end of round 3 or sometime in round 4, you usually already have a pretty good idea of who's going to win, unless it's like a very, very particularly close game. But a lot of the time, if you see one player is much higher up on the resource track than their opponents already, or they've got a bunch of, they've got their assistants out earlier, there's just, they're getting more actions every round. Usually that's not going to suddenly change. Like, there's not a lot of ways in Lost Ruins of Arnak to make a comeback, or because you fell behind one round, it doesn't mean that you're going to suddenly kind of springboard forward like in Dune Imperium with your, winning a conflict after you kind of left your garrison, your troops in your garrison for a future round. In Lost Ruins of Arnak, usually once you fall behind by a certain amount, like, yeah, if it's a few points, sure, you can come back, but most of the games I've played of Lost Ruins of Arnak, by round 3 or 4, I usually have a good idea of whether I'm in pole position to win or if I have no chance, and then you're kind of just playing out the rest of the game to see how much more you can get done before the end. But comebacks are pretty infrequent in Lost Ruins of Arnak, and I just find that whole runaway leader thing, again, as the rounds get longer and longer and your scores get further and further apart because someone has this engine they've built where they're, getting these assistants that get them this ability, that move them up the track, that trigger this other thing. It kind of has that snowball effect that like a roll and write game has sometimes when you uncover these icons and stuff. So yeah, I definitely preferred the way the scoring works in Dune Imperium, and just found that the scoring didn't really add anything interesting to the game in Lost Ruins of Arnak. The other thing I have to mention about Lost Ruins of Arnak that I didn't quite like is that it felt like the resource track, the research track is so important, and that, I've won Lost Ruins of Arnak a couple times where I didn't get a single Guardian, or maybe I got one Guardian for 5 points, but I found that when I've prioritized the research track, I've had the most success. In any games where I've tried to prioritize a little bit more going for the Guardians, I've just lost, because going for the Guardians early doesn't really get you ahead or unlock as much future potential in the same way that the resource track does. So that's one of my big issues with Lost Ruins of Arnak, is just that the scoring feels like it's pointing you in the direction to get ahead early and move up that research track so that you can kind of snowball and get ahead more and more and make it kind of just impossible for your opponents to catch up. So now we're going to talk about the game arc, and I've kind of touched on this a little bit already in scoring in some of the previous categories. Lost Ruins of Arnak has a very surprising game arc the first couple times you play, because in the first round, you feel like you almost can't get anything done. It feels like you're just getting a couple basic things done, collecting some resources, and you feel like, I didn't really do much that round. And then either the better you get at the game, and also the further you get into the game, round 2, round 3, you start to have this arc where suddenly you might have an assistant or two in your possession, or you might have acquired one of these idols that you have on your board from uncovering a new spot, and now these idols you can place on to cover up this point spot on your board, which allows you to trigger this new ability. So the arc of the game also, it does get more interesting as it goes on, because you're also uncovering new spots on the board. Because at the start, you just have those 5 basic spots, but as players get more compasses and go exploring and uncover more spots, now there's a little more of that intrigue, because you're thinking, well, now where do I really want to go? I have 2 workers, but there's all these new spaces, and do I go to one of these spaces that's already revealed to me where I know what's there, and maybe there is or isn't a Guardian there, I know I can defeat it, or maybe I'm going where there isn't a Guardian because I just want the reward. But if I go to that other spot that isn't uncovered yet, I can get the idol, and then who knows what's going to be under that Guardian. So the game does get, in a lot of ways, more intriguing as it goes on, because you have these cards in your deck now that are interesting that you're getting to play, more than just the boring original cards kind of thing. And there's just a little bit more you can do, but sometimes it also feels a little more like your strategy is also set to an extent. You have the assistants you're going to have, you have the cards in your deck that you're going to have, and now it's just a matter of making the best of it and seeing, well, I have these resources and this spot on the track requires them, so I'll just go there. So I think overall it still has a positive game arc, but it sometimes is in conflict with that aspect that I mentioned of the runaway leader and the scoring being kind of not all that interesting late in the game. So sometimes it can feel like, now I have my deck built, I have these cards, there's all these spots, but it might not matter that much because I'm so far behind that I'm probably going to lose anyway. Dune Imperium has the game arc not only of obviously building your deck of cards, getting stuff in there. You can unlock spots on the board that might make it cheaper to buy cards for the rest of the game, or you might again unlock your third worker and that sort of thing. You might gain these alliance tokens again where you're trying to beat people to them. And then the other thing I like is there's level 1, level 2, and level 3 conflicts, and throughout the game these conflicts kind of build up in terms of the value of their reward. So the later the game goes on, the bigger the reward is for these conflicts, so the more incentive you have to win these conflicts. So it's that you're kind of resisting temptation early on sometimes. Like, if the main reward isn't even a victory point, it's just like a bunch of spice, you're thinking, well, like, I could get in on that conflict, and like it might only take 1 or 2 troops to win that conflict, but I also might want to just save those for a conflict in a future round where I can get points. And I just find that really interesting. And another thing that leads into the game arc is not knowing if the game is going to end in that round or not until someone again reaches that 10-point mark. And sometimes that happens after everyone's actions have been done and you resolve the conflict and now someone has gone above 10. So I just like how this game is always unpredictable right till the end. The tension ramps up throughout the game, again, right to the end. I really like the game arc a lot more in Dune Imperium than I do in Lost Ruins of Arnak, even though both games definitely give you that sense of escalation, of progression, of kind of getting stronger. They both definitely do that very well, but I just think that Dune Imperium is more interesting the later the game goes on compared to Lost Ruins of Arnak. So now I want to talk about trackable versus secret information, and how this leads into kind of calculation and sort of parts of games I've mentioned before in this on this channel that I'm not always a big fan of games where you can calculate all of your decisions, or say like, well, if I go here I'll get and do this and this, I'll get 3 points, but if I go here and do this then I'll get 4 points, or if I get this then I can convert that to this. Like, I want the decisions to be a little more hidden, so I'm kind of hedging my bets on things and trying to say, well, if I do this, I don't know yet what the ramifications are long game. I can't just say, well, if I do this, then I can do this, then I can do this, and then it will lead to that. Yeah, that's obviously the better option, so why would I take the other one? I like it when things are a little more hidden, a little more obscured, and I think that's the case in Dune Imperium. I think that both games have their aspects of things that are hidden, but so in Dune Imperium, you have the intrigue cards, which are a huge part because so much of the game comes down to those conflicts. Because, if you didn't win the conflict but you invested a lot in it, that might end up being a big loss to you. You might have spent a whole bunch of troops thinking it's only going to be worth it if I win this conflict, and then you get second. So a lot of the time, these intrigue cards that you're potentially drawing throughout the game, there's this part where it comes around during the conflict and you say, do you want to play an intrigue card? And you have to think, is it worth it to play this or not? And that hidden info, those cards that you have hiding behind in your hands, and the thing is that you can see, like, you can always, it's open information how many intrigue cards someone is holding, but there's different types of intrigue cards. There's plot cards, which you can just play at any time on a turn. There's all kinds of various abilities. Then there's the combat intrigue cards, which come into play only during combat. And then there's end game intrigue cards, which are just saving, and at the very end of the game you're going to reveal them, and they might influence your points or something that you get at the end. So even if I look and I see that my opponent has 3 intrigue cards, I don't know if 0 of those cards are combat cards, if 2 or 3 of those are combat cards. I never know what they're going to be able to do in that conflict, so it keeps you second guessing, and sometimes you have to overinvest in a conflict and go way overboard on how many troops you have in just to secure the victory. And sometimes you might go overboard and it still might not be enough, and someone might play 2 intrigue cards and still overtake you. And I really like that. Other than that, a lot of the rest of the stuff in Dune Imperium is pretty open information. Like, other than the intrigue cards, a lot of it is kind of up for everyone to see, other than like what you've drawn in your hand. It's a little more unpredictable in terms of when you're going to draw which cards, because they just go into your discard pile when you buy them, and then you're going to be shuffling up your deck, and so you don't know when you're drawing the cards, you don't know when other players are going to draw the cards that they played, and so you can't really plan for synergies as much because the cards are going to come up in unpredictable orders and that kind of thing. Lost Ruins of Arnak does have a lot of hidden information because there's the face down, again, that whole second and third area of the worker placement board starts off with these like face down guardian tokens, so you don't know what's there until you actually go to the spot. So there's that aspect of the hidden information, but in terms of things that are trackable, like once that's flipped over, you can see, what's there and what you need to do to achieve that goal there. And once other players are acquiring assistance, you know what assistance they have, what abilities that's going to grant. When they have idols, sure, you might not know which ability they're going to use that idol for, but they have an idol, and kind of you have an idea of what it can be used for and that kind of thing. So a lot of the game ends up coming down to just calculating, figuring out again, okay, so to go up that spot on the resource track, I'm short one, red gem, one ruby. So to get that ruby, but I can play this, use this assistant to upgrade a resource. But before that, I would play this card. Okay, so then I just have to I'll play the card first to get the resource, then I'll use the assistant to upgrade it. Then I can move up the resource track, which will then give me this new thing, which will let me draw a new card. And you're usually just trying to figure out the best order to do things to squeeze as much of that efficiency as you can out of every round. And so a lot of it, there isn't a whole lot of hidden information other than the stuff that's, again, under those Guardian tokens. And because you, in Lost Ruins of Arnak, because when you buy a card, it goes to the bottom of your deck. If you buy, let's say, 2 cards in a row, you're going to draw them one after the other, and you know that the way there's just a little bit more predictability in terms of the order you're going to get your cards or how soon you might get those new cards you bought. And your deck tends to usually be smaller, more thinned out compared to Dune Imperium, so I like when there's a bit of that, more of that unpredictability and more of that hidden information, and I think that Dune Imperium does that more than Lost Ruins of Arnak does. So for me personally, I'm going to give the nod to Dune Imperium, but if you like to be able to calculate everything, if you don't like being surprised and realizing, I invested in this conflict and then someone just played this card that I didn't know they had, like if that feels bad to you, then you might not like that about Dune Imperium, and you might prefer having Lost Ruins of Arnak where you have control over things and you can plan a bit better and your plans won't get ruined quite as much. So now let's talk about variability. We'll start with Lost Ruins of Arnak because I was just talking about the face-down Guardian tokens. So every game you're going to do this random layout of the Guardian tokens. So that's one aspect of variability right from setup. Another thing is there's 2 sides to the board. There's the Bird Temple and the Snake Temple. So they have different kind of paths and different symbols on the different spots. So it kind of just changes it up a little bit. It's not like it's a completely different game, but they give you enough variety that it does feel different enough to play either side of the board. Lost Ruins of Arnak, you're also going to have the variety in terms of what's in the starting, what are the starting cards in the card row, which cards are going to come out throughout the game, which artifacts are going to come up, that kind of thing. But otherwise, like the research track is always the exact same. The variability from game to game is going to come more from, which spots you choose to go to, what guardians are going to be uncovered, in which order. That is really what's going to be the variety from game to game, and which your first few cards that you buy sometimes are going to determine which direction you go with your strategy. Are you trying to go heavy into getting certain resources and converting them? Are you heavy into drawing a lot of cards? Are you going to buy a lot of cards from your deck? That kind of thing. But there isn't maybe as much variability from game to game in this, other than, again, the face-down Guardian tokens. Dune Imperium so every player has basically a starting power, a character that they play as, where it's whether it's Paul or Duke Leto or whatever, the Baron. So you have an ability you're gonna have 2 abilities on that card. One is gonna be kind of an ongoing ability, like one of them, I can't remember which one, says like, other players can't block you on the green or blue spaces. So if someone's there, you can already go there. And then every player's gonna also have a Signet Ring ability, which is gonna be, you have a card called the Signet Ring, and when you play it, it'll let you trigger that ability on your power. So there's that in terms of variability. Again, there's the cards that come up in the card row, and because the cards, there's more variety in the cards here in terms of, like, there's faction symbols on them, like there's Fremen cards, there's Bene Gesserit cards, there's what are they called? I can't remember what the red ones are called now. Anyways, we'll skip over it. There's different symbols, so even just the starting market might determine where you go with your strategy. You might see one of those Bene Gesserit cards that says if you have another Bene Gesserit card, but if there's none other in the market row, you might not want to buy it right away, versus, if there were a bunch of Bene Gesserit cards in the market row, you might all be fighting to try and get those to get that synergy early. There isn't as much of the synergizing kind of thing with the card market in Lost Ruins of Arnak. The other thing is, just in terms of the order that the conflict cards are going to come up, the order of the intrigue cards. So the variability in Dune Imperium is going to come from the combination of starting powers that players have, as well as just the way you go with starting your, building your deck. The other thing is there are strategies where you're, focusing more on actually building up your deck and buying more cards for your deck. And there's other ones where you might be just going for that third worker early on. You might be, racing versus trying to build a bigger army or whatnot. So I wouldn't say either game has like an incredible amount of variability from one game to the next. But from the amount of plays I've had, like I've I've played Dune Imperium more times than Lost Ruins of Arnak, and I've felt that there's more variety from game to game in Dune Imperium, even after more plays, compared to Lost Ruins of Arnak. And a big reason for that is that Lost Ruins of Arnak is usually just going to be that sort of resource efficiency puzzle and trying to figure out how you can best do that. And the more you play the game, the better you get at that aspect, and then over time, you're just trying to be more and more efficient. So replay value. I've sort of touched on this a little bit here in Variability. So Lost Ruins of Arnak, I felt like each time I played it, I've enjoyed it less. Maybe aside from my first time. I think I played it the first time and thought that was pretty cool, and then maybe the second time I enjoyed it a little bit more because I fully understood the rules and I was able to do a little bit better. But Lost Ruins of Arnak felt like a game where I was mostly competing against myself and my own ability to be as efficient as I could. So as soon as I did well and I won a couple games of this and I felt like, oh, now I've kind of figured out how to get ahead early and how to be really efficient early and what's kind of good things to get at different points in the game so that you can kind of snowball. Like once you kind of unlock that next level and you start doing well at Lost Ruins of Arnak, for me personally, I felt like there was very little incentive to go back. Like even now, I've gone and played it on Board Game Arena quite a few times, and I enjoyed the process of improving at the game and trying to figure out how to be more efficient and kind of just comparing, going for Guardians versus going for the research track a little more. But even after the, 6-7 times I've played it, like I kind of feel like I've seen all there is to see. I don't think I'm ever going to be the one to request to play it again. It's fine. It's a fine game. I would play it again with people if they wanted to, but again, the replay value for me has gone down ever from, let's say, the second or third play. I've enjoyed it less and less each time I've played, and I don't think there's, maybe the expansion will make me feel a bit differently, but as of now, I just feel like there isn't really a whole lot, begging me to come back to the game. I've seen almost all the cards in action by now, even a lot of the artifacts, so there really isn't a whole lot left to explore. And if I really wanted to play a game where I was just trying to be as efficient as possible and compete against other people, there's just other games I would pick ahead of this, which I'll talk about a bit later in the video. Dune Imperium definitely feels like it has more replay value because of that tension, that kind of aspect of getting to the end of the game and not knowing, are you going to be able to win that final conflict? Are you going to get to 10 points? What if you and someone else both get to 10 points? Who's going to get above 10 if possible? Or which tiebreaker is going to come down to? Playing as the different characters right from the start. There's that incentive too. Like every time I've played, I've said, I want to play as a different character. So that's an interesting thing to explore. Even just going into different factions, saying this game I'm going to go heavy into the Fremen cards, this game I'm going to go into Bene Gesserit cards. Even the last time I played, I got by far the most the Spice Must Flow cards compared to other times where I normally didn't go for those as much. So it just feels like every time I've played this, I've never ended a game of Dune Imperium and thought, that felt pretty similar to the last time, or that felt similar to this other time I played it. It always feels like a somewhat different game just because of the kind of organic way that the cards that come up in the market row determine which spaces players are going to go to and in which order, and if someone gets too far ahead on a track, you might not try to catch up to them on that track anymore, or the order that these conflicts come up. I just feel like the replay value is stronger in Dune Imperium, and even across different player counts. Like this is one that I want to come back to many more times, and my enjoyment of the game has increased every time I've played it, which is kind of the opposite that I could say about Lost Ruins of Arnak. Final category here is Novelty. And the reason I wanted to include this is because, we've, again, going back to the whole deck building and worker placement thing, and people mention again, like, oh, there's not many games out there that have deck building and worker placement. And that's true. One other one that's fairly new, I don't know if it's actually come out yet officially, or if it's slated to come out later this year. I don't know if it's fulfilled to backers. It was a Kickstarter game. It's called Endless Winter, Paleo Americans. I've not played it yet. But aside from those, there aren't really a lot of games. There are games that have some worker placement and some card stuff going on, but in terms of combining the two, there might not be a whole lot of them out there. But again, these games aren't necessarily primarily deck building and worker placement games. I would say, again, Lost Ruins of Arnak is more of a resource conversion game, so the novelty factor for me isn't super high. I mean, there isn't anything quite like it out there, but there's nothing in this game that would make me think, hey, I really want to show this to someone because I want to show them this aspect of the game. Or there isn't that hook, that one interesting mechanism that makes me go, oh yeah, I really want to show someone how this works. There are some interesting things in the game for sure, but even playing it the first time and seeing the way that the worker placement combines with the deck building, with the resource conversion and buying the cards, there's a bit of novelty there, but it wears off pretty quickly, and then again, it just becomes that game of how can I be as efficient as possible right from the start. Dune Imperium also maybe doesn't have a ton of novelty to it, but I will say the aspect of how the cards really dictate the worker placement spots and how the different sections on the board are, and how you realize more and more the game goes on that suddenly you're like, I really needed to go to that spot, but I didn't buy enough cards with that symbol, or I trashed those cards from my deck, and it really makes you realize how important it is to buy the cards, not just for their ability, but also for what they, where they let you go on the board. And so that's the most novel aspect of the game to me. And I also haven't played a worker placement game where you're taking actions throughout the round, but then there's a central conflict at the end of every single round that everything you do throughout could or could not be feeding into that. And that's something that I've played a decent amount of worker placement games, and I haven't quite seen it done that way. So those are a couple of the aspects of Dune Imperium that I feel are pretty novel, that even if you don't think there's anything all that exciting about combining worker placement with deck building, the aspect of the cards determining where you can go, and the whole aspect of the conflicts and the intrigue cards, like, there's enough in here that every time I felt it, I always am reminded of, like, yeah, I don't really have another game in my collection, right? I haven't played any other games that are quite like this. So it does fit into a little more of a niche and have its own uniqueness and novelty, more than Lost Ruins of Arnak, I would say. Final verdict, probably no surprise. In my opinion, I think Dune Imperium is a much better game, a much more interesting game. This isn't to disparage Lost Ruins of Arnak. I think, especially if you're newer to the hobby, or you haven't really seen what's out there as much yet, or, you don't like games that have really high player interaction, you like to kind of be left alone to do your own thing a little more, or you like that aspect of resource conversion and trying to be really efficient, like, Lost Ruins of Arnak does a lot of things well. I just think that it's, and I'm going to say the same thing about Dune Imperium, I think both of these games are a little bit overrated, to be honest. Pretty overrated, actually. Like, I think as of filming this video, I think last I checked, Dune Imperium was number 14 or 15 on the all-time BGG rankings, and I think Lost Ruins of Arnak was in the early 30s, maybe 32 or so, and I think neither of these games belongs anywhere near even the top 50, in my opinion. Like, I like Dune Imperium quite a bit, but it's, I don't know how long it's going to stay in my top 50 personally, and there's a lot of games out there that I know I haven't played yet that are probably better than it. I just think both games were overhyped a lot because of the deck building and worker placement, and there's a lot to like about both the games, especially Dune Imperium for me, but I do think that both of the games, get a lot more hype and attention than they deserve. But when people ask, people always ask that thing, which one should I get? I don't want to own both. Honestly, if you like both of these types of games, like, there's no reason not to own both. It's not like owning one, you're never going to play the other, or that one of them, like, they are very, very different games, and that was the whole point of this video, was to really highlight how different they are, and how different people who want more interactive, fighty, tense games might like one, whereas other people who might want, to do their own thing a little more and just focus on the resource conversion might prefer another game. So they really are different, and, either one could be for you depending what you're looking for, but if I had to say, I really do think that Dune Imperium is the much better game, and the one that I'll be looking forward to playing many, many more times over the coming years, whereas Lost Ruins of Arnak is one that I might be somewhat reluctant to play. I would probably agree to it, but it's never going to be my first choice, and there's probably going to be a bit of a feeling of, I wish we were playing something else while we're playing it. But that's all I got to say about these games. I know this was a pretty long, pretty in-depth video, so thank you if you stuck through it the whole way. Let me know your thoughts. Have you played both of these games? Do you find one much better than the other? Do you think they're both pretty similar? Have you played any other deck-building worker placement games, whether it's Endless Winter that I mentioned, or any other ones that I might not be aware of or might be forgetting of? Let me know your thoughts. I'm always curious to hear what you think about this. And more importantly, feel free to jump on over to our Discord server. I think we've got about 500 people there now, and I feel like this topic of Lost Ruins of Arnak versus Dune Imperium comes up there pretty often. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people talking about this once the video goes up, so feel free to join us there. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching as usual, and I'll see you next time.